Fighting terrorism online is one of those ideas that everyone agrees with in principle, but disagrees on in practice. How do we stop the spread of violent extremism without introducing creeping censorship? Is the battle being won? To discuss, please welcome from the Intercept, Sam Biddle, the CEO of the Institute of Strategic Dialogue, Sasha Havlicek, 20-year veteran of the FBI and now cybersecurity boss at Aon, James Trainor, and Chief Software Security Officer at Intel, Windows Snyder.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today, and thank you to these excellent panelists for joining me as well. Let's get it started. It's undeniable that technology has advanced in the past year, in the past 5 years, in ways we couldn't have fathomed. But why does it feel like things online, in computers, in our devices, are getting scarier and more dangerous and more complicated? Why is the defense not matching pace with the offense? I'm curious what any of you think about that.
So,
Window, please.
Even though we get better at securing our technology, we get better at building platforms that make it easier to secure the technology we build on top of them, offense also gets better at finding ways around the mitigations that we develop. So it's going to be a constant battle, but on the bright side, we're not just playing whack-a-mole, trying to chase issue after issue. We are developing broad categories of mitigation. We are developing ways that make it easier for folks who are building on top of these technologies to leverage security mechanisms from the underlying platform. So without knowing a whole lot about how to develop secure applications, technology developers are able to leverage these mechanisms to secure the systems that they're building on top of these platforms.
I would just say that a variety of drivers of increased cyber risk, so not the least of which is more connectivity, particularly with IoT. And in the coming years, we're talking about going up to potentially 20 billion or plus devices. So greater connectivity, more data in size, the evolution of cryptocurrencies, the evolution of cybercrime and the various threats make folks feel more vulnerable, and the risk to companies obviously are significant that we've seen over the last several years.
I think it's just that bad actors have realized quite early on that this is a treasure trove. It's a toolkit that gets them a lot of what they want. So they're able to use the internet in a number of different ways. When we're talking about terrorists, they use the internet to propagandize, to get share of market ideationally. They use it to raise money. They use it to operationalize attacks. But it isn't just terrorists. We've got a whole range of bad actors that have realized that this is a space, in a sense, open for them to abuse. And they are activists. They're sort of disproportionately activist. And I think they were early adopters of these technologies. And actually, I think we've all been on the back foot in understanding how big a threat that has been.
Do you think bad actors have expanded their capabilities, or it's just a matter of us in the media reporting on it more?
Well, it depends on what bad actors. What we see now is a combination of state and non-state actors, often coordinating to some extent in order to have political impact, in order to mobilize violence. And we see that that's working in a number of different contexts, whether it's in electoral context, whether it's in the context of hate crime, which has been monumentally on the rise in almost every market around the world, and of course terrorism. So they're mobilizing quite effectively. I think we've seen governments focus heavily on obviously things like terrorist financing. The cybersecurity space, I think, is doing a great job. The challenge, in a way, is this ideational piece, the propagandizing, the reaching out to people and mobilizing them, recruiting them. And for free and open and democratic societies, I think that's the big, big challenge. Governments have focused a lot on the removal of content in terms of terrorist propaganda, and there's been big moves in that direction, but it's a much more complex space.
Sure. Jim, you come from decades of government service. Window, you have many, many years of corporate work in the security space. Whose responsibility is it to keep us, the users, the citizens, safe, ultimately?
I'm pretty agnostic about who the attacker is. If I'm building a secure system, I'm building it to be secure against anyone. I don't care about the motivation for the attack. I care about making the platform or the technology resilient to people who are not intended to have access to that system. I think it's more effective to build this way rather than to try and say this type of actor we're trying to keep out with this sort of skill set, because that skill set's going to change over time. The information that they have access to will change over time. So if you're trying to build a technology or a platform or system to be resilient for the long term, then it needs to be agnostic to the attacker.
Yeah, I would think it. My position is cyber is a team sport, meaning that it has to be industry, it has to be government. Industry will continue to evolve and create wonderful products, and I think in the cybersecurity space, in particular, you see a lot of innovation, and you'll see some disruption in that market, particularly because of the consolidation of features into online platforms. Government has to do a better job of establishing cyber norms. Also, doing more disruptions that there are consequences for perpetrating this activity, whether you're a terrorist or whether you're a hacker. And there has to be real consequences and it's not just going to be the U.S. government, it's going to be an international community that does that.
To Window's point, I think it's interesting that the private sector approach is looking at these problems from a systemic perspective. Governments have actually done something else. They've come to the companies and said, oh, first, we've got this massive problem of child sexual exploitation, deal with that. Then the terrorism challenge started to emerge, and now deal with that. Now the hate speech piece, deal with that. Now electoral interference. Actually, what we see is, requests coming at the companies to deal with these issues, and an entire sort of sector working in silos on these individual problems. And we do desperately need to be working in a much more coordinated way across these harms. And actually, what we desperately need is some kind of forum, a governance platform that engages civil society, that engages governments, that engages the private sector in a way, because these are complex challenges. It's one thing when you're talking about the removal of, let's say, a beheading video. Branded violent content is in a way an easy problem to solve, and certainly the companies, the major companies have done a lot to make sure that all of that's removed fast. Even though there was pushback early on, they've done huge amounts. They've established the Global Internet Forum on Counterterrorism. They're sharing, hashes around that content. They're doing a lot to remove it. But the wider space, the gray area of content, which also exists in terrorist terms, so non-branded, non-violent terrorist recruitment content actually is often the most effective. But that gray area challenge, which applies to the hate speech space more broadly, is a massive problem for us. And I think any approach is not complete if it's only about removal. We have to be thinking about competition strategies. We have to be thinking about longer-term education investments. Those are some of the things I think that one can do a lot with the major companies on. But the thing that nobody's really looking at in a big way is the wider ecosystem. So all the focus, all the attention has been on the major platforms, but actually this, of course, has already migrated off into, smaller platforms. An alt tech space has emerged as the big companies have started to try and moderate and remove the bad actors progressively more and more. They are fleeing into their own spaces. They're creating their own tech ecosystems. That's something we need to be really aware of and respond to.
I mean, at the same time, Twitter is basically Amazon for neo-Nazis. It's, you can't escape the white supremacists anywhere on the web, and Twitter seems to have been doing a pretty poor job of taking care of that. I wonder how much we should be looking to them to solve this or any problem. But I also worry about asking the government to step in and start banning people from a social network. There doesn't really seem to be a good answer, whether we're talking about, cybercrime is a law enforcement issue, but pushing cyber criminals off of the internet also gets into speech and free expression issues. And I personally don't have a solution to this, which is why I'm here with you smart people. Is this just intractable? Give me some hope.
Well, the large focus, again, was on Islamist terrorism. For a long time, the far-right problem didn't receive the attention that it really deserved. And now we see, I think, finally the penny dropping on how big a challenge this is, not only in terms of hate crime and wider mobilization, the mainstreaming of these attitudes, polarization and so on, but also in terms of extreme right terrorism. Just yesterday we had a potential attack on Macron. This is happening, 5 thwarted far-right terrorist attacks in the UK. This is going to be a much bigger problem, I think, over the coming period. And again, actually, the moderation is catching up with the evolution of that terrorist picture, in part because governments haven't been quite so active and in pushing the tech sector to do something about this. But it does beg the question, really, of, should we be looking to get rid of these actors off the main platforms? Does that serve the purpose? Does that ultimately have an impact on the problem? Or does it drive it underground in ways that makes it more effective? We actually don't really know that. We haven't got enough data, we haven't got enough evidence around that. There needs to be more A/B testing of responses to understand what this really means. I mean, it does imply that, some kid is less likely to come across nasty stuff in that mainstream space, but it may mean that we're creating sort of hardened militias in other domains.
Even before we start infringing on speech or freedom, there are things we can do with technology to reduce the problem. For example, we can separate the interactions that might be a human to a human from the interactions that might be scripted for bots. So by identifying the ways that the bots interact with these different systems, we might be able to reduce the out-of-scale impact one of these hate groups might have, because they're able to amplify their voice beyond what normal human interaction might be able to do on a platform. So we can do things like identify places that these folks are coming from, the bot network in this case, identify the ways that they are engaging with the system that might be different from how real humans interact, identify the signals in their messages that are generated instead of composed by a real human. And in that way, we can reduce the impact that they're having, which is out of scale with the numbers of people who are really involved.
I mean, the crux of your question is really about censorship and what role does government or industry have in regulating the activity online. From a terrorism perspective, I think it's pretty clear, it's one thing to have freedom of speech and freedom of expression, but when you're advocating violence, it's pretty clear that that is obviously unacceptable behavior. When you get involved in nation states or other activity influenced via social media, it can become more challenging. And whether it's Twitter, whether it's Facebook or LinkedIn or other social media platforms, I do think there's a role from them, probably even less so from government. Government perhaps more in a regulatory space, requiring regulatory requirements on this industry, but them policing up, accounts that are being misused. Because I don't think it's necessarily in their best interest to have the vast majority of their customers and using their platform being influenced for malicious purposes. So it is tricky. How you navigate that is complex, but I suspect that governments, whether it's in the EU or the US, will at some point get involved in this, just because of the privacy implications that we've kind of seen over the last several years.
Well, Jim, I mean, you come from a law enforcement background. How do you feel about a company like Twitter or Facebook doing police work of sorts? I mean,
yeah, it's not necessary. I wouldn't characterize it as police work, but I do. They have terms of service, and it's and we see this particularly, say, in financial services industry, which is heavily regulated, and knowing your customers and ensuring that those accounts are not being used to money launder or other kind of financial fraud kinds of things is important, and the industry has actually thrived over years. clearly in the social media space, it's far less regulated. Now, it's not an apples-to-apples comparison, but I do think there's a corporate responsibility to ensure that their infrastructure is not being used for malicious purposes. How that is established is still to be determined, but I do think it's fundamentally that's where, kind of the way I view it.
Just to Windows' point about bots, the sort of distortion, if you like, of speech in the online world, I think that's a really, really important point. And being the companies looking at basic cybersecurity measures that can cut down on some of that distortion, I think, are very important. But it raises another question, which is really around algorithmic design and transparency. Product design, some of the things that enable us to fall into spaces that feed us content in a way that may not be transparent, may not be organic for us. And I think that there is a bigger conversation to be had on transparency in that context, because this is where, of course, influence really happens.
Well, are you comfortable with an algorithm deciding who might be a potential terrorist? Or
no, that's not at all what I mean. But
Yeah.
what I mean is that we, in terms of echo chambers, in terms of filter bubbles, when young people fall into these spaces unknowingly, they can be disproportionately influential. And I think those are the sorts of conversations that we need to be having in terms of essentially this not being a question of free speech, but distorted speech, or a distorted environment in terms of speech. And that I think we haven't really started to address in a big enough way.
Jim, you mentioned the word privacy. It occurs to me that one of the biggest changes over the past 5 years is the real explosion of consumer encryption and of consumer privacy tools that are quite strong. People have an interest in communicating securely and privately like they haven't in years past. That presents a challenge for law enforcement. On the other hand, we want to be able to talk without anyone eavesdropping. Can you talk about that tension, whether it needs to be a tension, or which side you lean towards? I think I might guess which side you lean towards, but I don't want to. I don't want to pigeonhole you.
You might be wrong. You may be wrong on that. It's always going to be that tension between privacy and security. The U.S. government has a position. They have an expression called "going dark." The ability of law enforcement to protect the country is inhibited by security, by encryption and privacy. But my view is that my personal view is that it's a little bit kind of the horse has left the barn. Encryption's there, technology's there. I think more and more people that become safe with having privacy in the long run is a better thing. And law enforcement in particular has to evolve in order to be creative, in order to gather the information they want. That can become more and more challenging, and the ability for the U.S. government to regulate encryption outside its domain is just not there. So whether or not they really wanted to do it or not, it's in some respects is irrelevant because of just the the innovation that we see around the globe. So I think law enforcement simply needs to evolve to be more creative.
It's kind of back to basics on intelligence gathering, isn't it?
It's human sources, it's partnerships, and people make mistakes. I mean, ultimately, when you're putting together a puzzle of a crime, whether it's a terrorist organization or a cyber hacker, people make mistakes online. They log in without a VPN. They use an email account, or they use a credit card or some other wallet that's been exposed at some point. So it just takes time. The problem with terrorism is the potential loss of life, and that's where that conflict and challenge is created.
Well, because with any privacy-oriented tool, there's the risk that it's going to become the next Telegram or something, where it's going to become a favorite of terrorists who mean to do actual real harm. It seems like it would be pretty short-sighted to then assume that that's going to be a weapon or a danger to society, but that's become a popular opposition to consumer encryption. And Window, you work in making systems secure and advocating for that kind of security. Is that a challenge with your work?
Well, no, as I began by saying that I design systems to be secure and agnostic to the attacker. And if that attacker happens to be law enforcement or government, then that's potentially a problem for them. But if you're building technology that's going to be used by a global audience, then it's important for your users to feel confident in the technology that you build and not feel like under some circumstances, some partner has special access into it. That would undermine the ability to be a trusted technology provider to all your different customers. So I don't think it's really practical for governments to perceive this to be an opportunity for them, because it would undermine their technology economy
Right.
to create an environment where the rest of the world can't trust the technologies that you build. If you build a secure technology, it should be secure for all potential attackers, and it should protect the information, the connection, the integrity of the system for the users that are using it, and for all others.
No matter who they are.
No matter who they are, they
Yeah.
should be excluded from access.
Right. Sasha, where do you come in on the on the privacy?
On the privacy,
Yeah,
on the
yeah.
privacy issue, well, again, I think we tend to look at this only from either from a sort of legislative and restrictive perspective. And I see this slightly differently. We work on extremism and radicalization and recruitment. And ultimately, what we desperately need is to mount a proportional response. The machinery that extremist groups have in place in order to get their messaging out, to engage people, to recruit them into their groups and to their causes, we haven't matched yet in the counter space. We're working with companies like Google and Microsoft and Facebook to try and if you like, upskill and upscale the civic response to these challenges. What we genuinely need is to use all the tools in the toolkit to mobilize a competition so that those kids have an alternative. And that hasn't been done enough yet. And then finally, I think long-term, we desperately need education, a sort of broad-based digital civic citizenship education, because all of these issues, whether it's fake news and propaganda, terrorism, extremism, all of these things that we're now, there's a sort of barrage of this stuff online. We desperately need to equip ourselves to be resilient to that, to understand what it is, to understand what it looks like. We tend to think that digital natives know what that is, but they are the least likely, for instance, in all the studies out there, to be able to tell truth from falsehood online. We desperately need universalized digital citizenship education. If we want to get proactive and ahead of the curve, that needs to be in place. We're doing some great work in that space with companies like Google. This is where I think the internet companies, the tech sector at large, needs to be investing. And of course, it needs to be investing in future-proofing that education, because the technology is changing every millisecond.
How do you find how do you stop someone from being radicalized without watching everyone? I mean, it seems like some of this sort of proactive, preventative stuff would require some degree of surveillance, at least algorithmic watching. I wonder how you protect someone's right to have a conversation without Facebook monitoring it, balanced against public safety.
It's a big challenge. I mean, we work only with publicly available data, and we're not asking for more than that. And there's a lot of this stuff which is just people posting stuff on their public sites, gives you a sense of what they're thinking and what they're trying to do. We're engaging with those people way too little. We've done a sort of scaled program of direct engagements with people who are expressing extreme violent views on a systematic basis, and extraordinarily, the rate of response and then the rate of sustained engagement with those individuals is extremely high. You can do quite a lot in terms of outreach. In a sense, we're taking what we know can work effectively offline into the online world. We need to be doing much more of that. This is not the prevention of terrorism. This is potentially risk reduction over time. But ultimately, it's also the sort of civic edification of our populations. We need to be, anyway, bolstering, in a way, the broader counter-narrative to these movements of hate and division. That's desperately needed now.
So you see this as an offline problem as much as an online problem?
Of course.
You're nodding, Jim.
Yeah, so I think from the FBI's perspective, it's something called homegrown violent extremists, these HVEs, and where they're radicalized. And in many respects, they're self-radicalized. They're in forums. They see postings of radical positions and the promotion of violence. But you're in your house, you're on the computer. Your ability for government to be aware of that is challenging. So it's really about having tripwires. It's really about outreach. It's really about the community coming forward when they see things of concern to bring that to the attention. We can, there's a technology component to that, but that's not going to work. And there's obviously some privacy implications to that. So it's got to be more of a kind of a comprehensive solution to prevent the radicalization and preventing violence.
And if I may,
Last
just
word,
the
Sasha.
last word on that.
Yeah.
It isn't. I don't believe that government should be doing that. That is a civic function, and so this is about civil society, communities, credible voices being enabled and empowered to do that work.
Terrific. Any last words, anyone? We're about to get run off the stage. All right, please give our friends here a round of applause. It's terrific. Thank you, guys. And thank you all.